Good evening, everyone. We're just going to gather a couple more minutes and then we'll get going. Patrice, I think we can get started when you're ready.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 130th and 145th Station Area Planning Environmental Impact Statement Community Meeting. Hopefully, I'm not a total stranger to you. Again, I hope that we've met at some previous meeting, but I'm Patrice Carroll, and I've been the project manager of this planning process for the City of Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development. And although we're meeting virtually tonight, I'm really excited to start this next phase of work that's going to go on for about 2 years. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to meet in person during this next phase of work. So we're just going to go through some meeting logistics. And Ben, did you want to walk people through this? Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, I didn't do introductions. Besides myself, we have a whole team here tonight. Our lead consultant is Burke Consulting, and they have done these kinds of studies for many municipalities throughout the Puget Sound region. And with us tonight is Lisa Gruder, who's a principal at Burke, and also Ben Hahn, who is a senior planner at Burke. Also part of our consultant team is Marcus Johnson and Rachel Miller from Makers Architecture and Urban Design. And I also have one of my colleagues from the Office of Planning and Community Development, Brennan Staley, who is working on the citywide EIS, which we call the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan Update. So you're going to meet all of them tonight. But first, Ben is going to walk you through just some logistics for the meeting tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrice. Again, my name is Ben Hahn with Burke. And so I'm sure everyone has had a Zoom meeting at some point or may not have familiarity with the Zoom program. And so during this webinar, if you have any questions at all with regards to any topics or materials being presented, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your questions, and that'll be sent directly to the panelists and the host of this meeting to look at. If you have any technical issues, like if you're having any problems with Zoom or just having general Zoom questions, you can send it through the chat feature. The chat feature is sent directly to the host and panelists only. And so we'll be able to work with you directly in any technical issues. Just want to send just a friendly reminder just to always be respectful. This is a public meeting space, and so people may have varying perspectives and viewpoints. And so always like to offer that. And finally, this meeting will be recorded and posted on our website. So for future reference as well. One thing unique that we're doing today is we thought we would try to do some fun interactive exercise with the folks here today in this virtual meeting space. And so what we're hoping to do is a program, surveying program called Mentimeter. And it's essentially designed to be an interactive surveying program. There are two ways in which you are able to participate with the survey if you choose to. One is there'll be a URL link that'll be shared in the chat that folks can click on. It'll open up a new browser window for you. And I can see people are really diving in already, which is great, which means it's working very well. And alternatively, if you have a phone and are familiar with QR codes, you can take the camera app on your phone, wave it over the QR code, and you can click the link on the screen. I'll take you to the first question slide already. And I can see that folks are very familiar with this process already, which makes my heart sing. So just some basic tips with Mentimeter. If you're choosing not to use the program, you are always more than welcome to submit your thoughts and around the question through the Q&A chat. Furthermore, some basic tips. There is a little bit of a lag between questions, and so I always ask for patience in doing so. One final tip is that oftentimes you might see a top-down screen come down from the top of your browser or your phone asking that the presenter has changed the slide. I would recommend you click the go to slide button to catch up or have an update on which slide I'll be on today as well. So with that, I thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to you, Patrice.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so if we could go to the next slide. Yeah, so here's our agenda for tonight. The EIS process is a kind of a technical process, so we want to go through some definitions first. Also, a quick review of the history of the project. Then we'll talk about alternatives, and this is the key thing for right now, for this phase of the project, is we want to talk about those alternatives and we want to get your feedback on some of those alternatives. And then we're going to have time for questions and answers. And if you're willing to hang in there, we're willing to hang in too, to try to get everybody's questions answered tonight. And so here's our first polling question.
Great. So the first question, as folks saw, how have you connected with this project in the past? Check all that apply. And it looks like people are really owning this Mentimeter app already. And thank you so much. And it's just a good way for us to get to know how you've heard about this program in the past.
Great. So it looks like we always have one or two newbies, but it looks like a lot of you have been engaged with this project. It's been a long haul, so thank you for hanging in there and for engaging again in this latest phase of the project. And here's our next question. And this is always an important, whenever we talk about planning, we can never ask this question too many times. What do you value most about living in your community? And I think because our engagement, a lot of our engagement was pre-pandemic, and I really wonder if people's views about what they value most has been changed over our experience over the past 2 years. Yeah, we'll give people a little bit more time. And yeah, walkability has always been on the top, but maybe a little bit more. Great. Trees, diversity, neighbors. Okay. So Ben, do you think everyone's kind of weighed in? Are we still getting some answers? All right. Yeah, these are a lot of familiar themes. So that we've heard over the past 3 years. So this is definitely looking very familiar to me. So I think let's dive in. And what is SEPA? I work for the city of Seattle, so I have a lot of acronyms that we like to use. So this is really what we call an environmental review process. And it's very rigorous, it's very detailed, and it gives us lots of information that we can then use to make decisions about what should happen in the future in this area. It gives us information, but more importantly, it gives you a lot of information about the impacts of what change might mean for this area. And it's really important, and it kind of drives comparing alternatives. That's a big part of this process. And it also has some very specific steps when we provide that information, and then when we get you get an opportunity to review it and to give us comments and feedback about it. So we'll talk about that a little bit in more detail. Next slide. So we're at the very, very beginning of this process in a phase that we call scoping. And scoping invites the public, tribal governments, other state and local and federal agencies to comment on the alternatives that we've proposed to study as part of this process. And the kinds of things that we measure, the impacts that we measure, and then the potential mitigation measures that we might analyze in this very, very rigorous study. So I am going to turn it over to Lisa Gruder with Burke Consulting, because she is by far our EIS expert, and she's going to walk you through the EIS process.
Thanks, Patrice. So as Patrice mentioned, the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement, is meant to be an informational document to provide information to the city and to the public about the implications of different alternatives and the natural and built environment. We did get a request in the chat to clarify the State Environmental Policy Act. I think we had a typo. It's the State Environmental Policy Act, not the State Environmental Policy Agency. So we will correct that. Thank you. Ben, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. We are showing here the contents of the Environmental Impact Statement. It's based on the framework in the State Environmental Policy Act rules at the Washington Administrative Code. And so it has the contents you see there on the left, the fact sheet and summary, alternatives, description, and then the evaluation of the environment impacts and mitigation measures and supporting material. So the station area, the 130th and 145th area, will be a subset of the analysis of the overall citywide One Seattle Plan EIS. We will cover a range of topics that we've summarized on the right-hand side there, from the natural environment, earth and water quality, air quality, to the built environment, noise and land use patterns, population, employment, housing and displacement, plants and animals, energy and natural resources, historic resources, plans and policies, relationship, and then a range of infrastructure like transportation, utilities, and public services. So again, we'll be doing the One Seattle Plan and the overall EIS, and 130th and 145th will be covered as a subset of that. I'm going to go to the next slide, Ben. The city has received a grant to do more focused review of the station area in the EIS. So there'll be a little bit more in-depth analysis of the station area in preparation for the zoning changes to come in the future ahead of opening the new stations. The environmental impact statement will allow the city to consider ways in which the environmental review process could be streamlined in the future for future proposals that will establish specific mitigation measures to condition future development. Turn it back to Ben.
Thanks, Lisa. So we're gonna move on to our next question in the Mentimeter app. The feedback I'm getting, I'll be sure that the answers are showing on the screen as well. And so bear with me for a second. And so the question on the screen is, what do you feel are the 3 most important EIS topics to understand? Environmental implications and trade-offs of different growth alternatives. And so if you have any issues with the excuse me, with the app, please feel free to use the Q&A section, but otherwise, looking forward to seeing answers.
Yeah, so I see transportation has always been a big issue for this area, and just want to remind folks that our colleagues at SDOT have done a study of the area, a multimodal mobility study, and they're also doing a citywide transportation plan. And so again, that would be a great process to follow in addition to this one. That's when they're really going to put together a package of actual improvement projects, not only for this neighborhood, but for all the neighborhoods in Seattle. And housing and displacement. And these are a lot of the same issues that are coming to the top in the citywide EIS as well. So these are issues that are shared across a lot of neighborhoods. All right, I think we're ready to move on. Looks like we might have gotten everyone to weigh in. So the history of the project. I know that some of you have been on this ride for a while. But let's look back and see where it all started. And the next slide. And really the reason that we're talking about change in this area is for one reason. It's because light rail is coming to this neighborhood. And that discussion started back in 2008 when Sound Transit was looking at planning the Linwood link and where there would be stations and where that alignment would be. And ultimately, although a station at 130th was studied, different combinations of stations, only the station in Shoreline at 145th, what is now the 148th station, Shoreline South Station, was approved as part of that package. But then in the next package, the ST3 package, the 130th station came back, and that was actually approved as part of that package. Although it wasn't intended, they didn't intend to build that station until 2031. So we weren't really doing any, we at the City of Seattle weren't really doing any planning around that because it was 15 years away. And that was a little bit too early to begin the station area planning. But then there was some thinking that perhaps that station would happen a little bit earlier. And so that's when we kind of came on board, was to start some of our work. But I know you in the community were doing we're following this process. I know there was a lot of community efforts, particularly during that ST3 process to get that station approved. And you were successful. That station did get approved. And that station did get accelerated. So it's not being built in 2031, but that station is being built now and is going to open in 2026. And actually just a few weeks ago, the Sound Transit Board approved the construction budget to complete that station. So finally, after 14 years, we have a lot of certainty about the 130th station, which, and we also are, and also part of that ST3 package was a rapid ride line along 145th. And that included a BRT station that we're also looking at 15th Avenue and 145th. So transit was really the driver for our planning. Next slide. And so we have a lot of, there's a lot of different steps that have already happened. Again, I was glad to see that so many people have been engaged in some of the previous community workshops and some of the online engagement that we've done. But, and we've released a series of reports and summaries of what we heard from the community. So if you haven't seen any of those, please visit our website, and that's all available for you to review. And we had a high-level plan that was approved with some of the things that we wanted to accomplish. And one of those things was to do this detailed study, this detailed environmental study that's necessary as part of looking at land use changes and new zoning in the area. And as Lisa said, we were able to obtain some grant funding from the state to support that. And so we're able to begin that work now. And so we're really in that implementation phase where we're trying to implement some of the recommendations that have been developed over the last 3 years. And the next slide. So again, this is our study area. So you see the 2 light rail stations, one in the Shoreline South Station, and then the station at 130th and I-5. And then so the circles represent a half mile, approximately a 10-minute walk from those light rail stations. And then we're also, as I said, we're also looking at the area around the BRT station that's at 145th and 15th Avenue. Looking at a little bit of a smaller area there, just a quarter-mile walk ship. About a 5-minute walk. And the next. So we have done some, we have already, done some planning with you. We are aligning this next phase of work with the City of Seattle Comprehensive Plan. And this is a plan that is looking citywide at where growth should occur. And that plan is very much done with leading in equity. So one of the goals is to address past systemic inequities and to also pay a lot of attention to displacement. That was a very high topic on our polling question earlier. So yes, that's top of mind for us as well. And then one of the other issues that's very relevant is climate change and how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How can we make the city more resilient? So at a citywide level, that is very important for this citywide update. And that is also going to filter down to this area as well, and particularly in a place where we're introducing light rail transit. That's a great opportunity to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So now the next slide. So over the past 3 years, we've worked with the community to identify issues, to hear about your dreams and aspirations. We've also worked with our colleagues at SDOT as they develop their multimodal mobility study. And looking particularly at they were focused on the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure in the area and how to get people to the light rail stations. And part of our process was to come up with this vision statement. And this is, again, it's a very aspirational statement to reflect some of the things that we heard that people wanted to see in the station area. We also had a draft survey and had a very positive response to this vision statement. So hopefully we really captured what you wanted, but it's that vibrant, walkable, a lot of the things that you already value about your neighborhood. I think it will strengthen those. So that's all summed up in this vision statement. And then the next slide. So again, some of the themes that we heard have been fairly consistent throughout the plan, that connections to the stations and also the connections to the adjacent communities of Bitter Lake and Lake City. Density, we heard a range of opinions. Some people would like to see lots and lots and lots of density, and other people not so much. There seemed to be a lot of consensus around having a bit more neighborhood serving retail, particularly right adjacent to the station, more affordable housing. I think that's something we hear in every neighborhood, and this neighborhood is no exception. But then also there's a desire to preserve some of those things that you do value. Some of those things we saw in the last polling, in the earlier polling question, the green space, the quiet, the trees. So those are, these again are things that we'll learn more about in our EIS study. And then the next slide. So this is all about alternatives. So let's move on to talk about what is an alternative. So in an EIS, we're required as part of this process to identify and to analyze different ways of meeting the goals. So if we want to see more density, we need to have different alternatives that represent different levels of growth. And we also, since this is nested within the citywide EIS process, we also got some guidance from council about what kinds of alternatives they would like to see. So that's also reflected in our project. One of the things to keep in mind is that we want the alternatives to be distinct, and we want it to be really arranged. So think of them as bookends. One end, no change, and then what's the upper end that we want to consider that would have more change. So it's a question of how much change would we like to see, would we like to study. And then doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to try and implement any of these alternatives. Again, the purpose of the alternatives is to give us more information. So this also shows some of the things that council wants us to look at citywide, which we'll also be looking at as part of the alternatives for this station area. They'd like us to look at alternatives that allow new types of housing in neighborhood residential areas. Also, they'd like to support, they have this idea of the 15-minute neighborhood where people can walk or bike to the things that they need in their daily lives. And then they also want us to develop strategies to address displacement. So these will all play out in the citywide analysis, but also the analysis for this station area. And next slide. So in our citywide analysis, we're going to be looking at 5 alternatives. We're not going to talk about all of these alternatives tonight, but what we wanted to demonstrate on this graphic was how the alternatives that we're going to study for this area nest into those 5 alternatives. So the ones with the stars are the alternatives that we're proposing to study for this station area. So alternative 1, that's what we call the no action alternative. We're required to study that. That alternative means we don't make any changes to the existing zoning. Alternative 2 is an alternative where we might add in the citywide alternatives, it's introducing some new nodes, whether they be an urban village or perhaps a smaller node. So that's an alternative that we would like to study here. We think that there can be some new nodes in the area. And then the densest alternative that we're proposing to study is relates to the citywide alternative number 5. And that's the one that makes the most change. So would introduce an new urban village, would also change all of the it might make changes in all of the neighborhood residential areas. So so some of the areas that are now single family houses, we might allow different types of housing to be built in those areas. So that's what we're proposing, and that's what we're looking for feedback on. And the next slide. So, and it's very much talking about these are the areas in the citywide alternatives that are identified for growth. So you've noticed that we've screened out urban center, because urban centers are places like downtown or Northgate. And that's not something that we see happening at the 130th, 145th station area. So that's for very different places. So we're not going to see any proposals for high-rise development. That would be something that we would consider in our urban villages. But we might consider an urban village, and that was something that we did explore in some of our earlier community workshops. So that's definitely something that we want to study and see what the impacts of that might be. And then we also think that the smaller nodes could also be appropriate. Corridors, we're studying such a small area that the corridors might not play a big role in our alternatives. And we certainly see, particularly for that densest alternative, that neighborhood residential areas could play a big role in these alternatives. And the next slide, please. And Rachel Miller is going to kind of walk you through a little more detail what some of these alternatives might look like. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks. We'll look at each of these 3 alternatives in more detail, so no need to read this slide. And we'll also put in the chat where a more detailed version of this is up online. So in general, as Patrice just described, they move from no change on the left in alternative 1 up through a little more and a little more change to alternative 3. Next slide, please. So you're looking now at what the citywide alternative is for number 1, no action. And as Patrice said, this one maintains the current strategy for urban villages and urban centers. So those are those big blue blobs. So the purpose of this one is to really show what existing policies would accomplish, which right now really put new growth or new rental apartments in existing mixed-use areas. But most of the land around that, in this little diagram, all the white areas between, would remain mostly high-cost single-family houses for the most part. So in this alternative, there are no new strategies to increase housing supply or address the exclusivity that can happen with those high-cost homes. Next slide, please. So what that means for the 130th and 145th areas is that the no action alternative continues the current zoning pattern. So what you see in front of you is a simplified version of Seattle's zoning for the area. And you'll see that there are already some pockets of mixed use and multifamily, those red and orange areas around Roosevelt and 15th. And there are some urban villages on Aurora and Lake City Way in those blue areas, but a little further from the station. Of note, those red and orange areas already allow around 45 to 80 foot heights. And notably also, which you all, if you were involved in past planning processes, may have noted that there's not much that seems to relate to the new station area in terms of zoning. Next slide, please. So again, we're back to the citywide plan, alternative 2, the focused one. This one adds the little lighter blue nodes. So as Patrice mentioned, there may be some opportunities with smaller nodes in 130th that would apply from this alternative. So the purpose of this alternative, this focused one, is that it could really connect people to housing options and amenities, businesses in their neighborhoods a little better and make use of those around transit and where there are already commercial spaces, and actually even creating more commercial space and at-home businesses in those neighborhood centers. So it really is about connecting people within their neighborhoods and creating those complete neighborhoods where you can walk within about 15 minutes to your everyday needs. Next slide, please. So what that means for alternative 2 in the 130th and 145th area is that you would see similar building types as alternative 1. It's just there might be they might be allowed in new small nodes of activity. So your past planning efforts may have looked at some of those location options, and so this work would continue that kind of analysis and look at those. Next slide, please. So the citywide plan, now we're skipping to alternative 5, and it's the combined one, and it looks at all the different options that the alternatives, the citywide alternatives 2, 3, and 4 are looking at. For us, notice that this combined alternative has these extra blue shaded areas. So the blue that covers up all that white where there were detached houses, it covers that up and represents a greater variety of housing types and home types and affordability levels. Also around corridors. And as Patrice mentioned, there might not be major corridors in this area that those would apply to. So the purpose of this one is really to increase variety and options, more rental and ownership opportunities, primarily in areas well served by transit. And it moves beyond the traditional urban village and urban center strategy of no action to address the past underproduction of housing and the rising housing costs that we're seeing with that, with the continuation of that strategy. And like we just mentioned in the last one, it also supports the complete neighborhoods where you can walk to your everyday needs or get there easily, and also creating more commercial spaces and at-home businesses throughout Seattle. Next slide, please. So again, overall, there's similar building types, just allowed in more locations. So if there were an urban village added in here, the building types might allow up to 95 feet. And then in the nodes of alternative 2, it would be pretty similar to alternative 2. But a bigger change for this one is that all those yellow areas, and actually this did happen in alternative 2, might allow more variety in those areas, but same heights. And more retail and commercial locations with this combined altogether alternative. I think that's it from me. Is it back to Ben now? Or Patrice?
Hey, we can co-host this one. So our last question for you all today is, I know there's been a lot of information that has been shared, and we'll move on to questions and answers shortly, but just wanted to ask folks if you had any general suggestions for Station Area EIS, and to just write your answers in the Q&A feature. And I think we'll be tracking these answers as they come through the chat as well.
Yeah. And Ben, I'm wondering if we could, I see some questions have already been entered in the Q&A, so maybe while folks are musing on this, do we want to start answering some of the questions?
Yeah, Patrice, I think we could start with a couple of questions from about the city of Shoreline and shoreline zoning, the coordination you're doing with the city, and whether they've already gone ahead and done some rezoning.
Yes. So the city of Shoreline, because that Shoreline South Station was approved like back in the 2008 cycle. So they have, they did their rezoning process and adopted new zoning about 6 years ago. And so they have seen some new development, initially not so close to the station, but just within the past 6 months, they've had several sites adjacent to the station have started a redevelopment permitting process. And so they are going to see some denser multifamily mixed use development around the station.
Great.
And we do coordinate with the planners. Actually, we check in with them periodically just to see what they're learning, what they're hearing from the development community. So it's a nice resource for us.
Thank you. A couple questions on why alternatives 1, 2, and 5 and not 3 and 4, and also will there be zoning maps associated with the alternatives?
So right now we're in scoping, so it's just concepts. And again, our idea was, because this is such a small area, that we wanted to have these bookends and then pick kind of one alternative in the middle. I think we probably could have picked, you know, several of the alternatives in the middle, but we wanted to pick the ones that would probably generate more distinct alternatives for this particular area. And also they do link a little bit with some of the conceptual work that we did earlier at our community workshop. We looked at expanding some existing nodes. We looked at kind of having one big urban village, or sort of stringing or targeting some, you know, or limiting development to sort of corridors. And although people liked aspects of each of those concepts, they wanted more of a, they wanted more. So I think that the alternatives that we've selected here, again, reflect some of the earlier feedback that we've gotten from the community. And as I said before, alternative 1, we have to study. So that's not a question. But if you think of it as like alternative 1 is kind of what you have now. So the kind of development and growth that you would see in the future is sort of what you kind of see now in that area, which would be maybe a single-story commercial parcel gets redeveloped for something that's denser. Or perhaps you see a single-family house, a small single-family house getting redeveloped to be a bigger single-family house, or maybe a single-family house with an ADU with an accessory dwelling unit, or perhaps even with a detached accessory dwelling unit. So those are the kinds of things, or a smaller apartment building being redeveloped for a larger apartment building. And at the other bookend, where we want to look at the most sort of development, I would say we're probably looking at something that might look like the Roosevelt Station. So the kinds of buildings that you see developing around that station would seem to be an appropriate kind of bookend for this area.
Thank you, Patrice. Can you comment a little bit about zoning maps? We showed a map, the current zoning, but we showed more concepts about how the other alternatives would work.
Yeah, so I think as we work through these concepts and refine them for the study, there will be more specific citywide concepts. And in terms of this area, we are gonna we'll have actual like zoning alternatives. So we're kind of going in process with the citywide alternatives, but ultimately our goal is to have at the end of the process to have a final sort of zoning proposal that's again based on the information that we've gathered during this process.
Thank you.
So Patrice, the next set of questions is kind of related to walkability and maybe a reference to one of the parts of the vision statement of roomy sidewalks. And just interested in how you see the EIS process will be kind of helping out building out sidewalks in the area, I think is what the person is asking.
Yeah, so the vision statement is an aspirational statement. So it's not supposed to be reflective of existing conditions. So, and this is something that we've heard all through the process, that people don't think there's adequate pedestrian infrastructure. And this was investigated in more detail by the Department of Transportation through their multimodal study. And they did, if you haven't seen that study did identify what they called 18 priority projects. And my understanding is that those projects will be studied in more detail. They'll do some additional design work. How much will they cost? Are there any impacts associated with those? So, so this plan would certainly, reflect the work that SDOT has done. I think their priority is really sort of the routes that get people to the station. Most of the new sidewalks will get built as part of new development. So there are some sidewalks definitely that will be part of the immediate station area. Either Sound Transit is building them. But in the future, most of the sidewalks in the area would be built as part of new development.
All right, thank you. And next set of questions, and I'll throw it to you, Patrice, first, and then maybe Lisa can also jump in, but just some clarification about what is being studied during the EIS, or does existing sewer systems and water system be part of the study of the SEPA analysis? And then also will tree canopy and tree cover be covered in the analysis as well?
Yeah, Lisa, do you want to talk about that? How you
Sure.
handled that?
Yes, we have as part of our team some folks that are civil engineers, and they'll be taking a look at water and sewer issues as well. We are going to cover the natural environment that includes, even in an urban setting, the urban tree canopy, and that would be covered in the EIS as well. The potential for changes to the urban tree canopy, which could also include if the city's proposing policies to further implement its tree canopy goals.
And I'll just add that we did a canopy cover analysis of citywide in 2016, and we're in the process of updating that. And so we're going to have a lot of data about how tree canopy has been changing over that period on detailed scale. We're going to also do a lot of research on looking at specific properties that have redeveloped during that period and what that has done for canopy cover. And so that will allow us to make kind of estimates of canopy cover under various scenarios.
Thank you. And Patrice, there's just one more, and we're going to go back to walkability because I missed it a little bit earlier, but it was just about experiencing sidewalks, or kind of shallow sidewalks along 145th next to the golf course, and just how this process will potentially aid in kind of widening those sidewalks or making that a better experience for pedestrians.
Yeah, well, that is an area that SDOT did identify as one of their 18 priority projects. So, so that's definitely a priority that they've identified.
Thank you. So there's a few questions on height. One is about whether 95 feet would be 9 stories or 10 stories. There are some folks concerned about going all the way to maximum building heights.
Yeah, so yeah, it will be like 9 to 10 stories height, sometimes depending on the slopes and blah, blah, blah. you know, there's a very technical way that they measure the building height, which I don't think we need to get into, but yeah, that's about the scale that would mean. And then, I'm sorry, then the second question was,
A concern about about going all the way to maximum heights. Without saying what height that meant, but just a concern about going to the maximum heights.
yeah, I'm not really sure. We're not having a proposal right now. So we'll just be studying
Mhm.
certain heights. But that isn't, we're not ready to make any kinds of proposals. So there's a whole section in the EIS that talks about height and bulk. Lisa, maybe you want to say a few words about that?
Sure.
About the impacts.
And Rachel is welcome to join as well, but yes, there will be an aesthetics section that will look at height and shade and shadow effects, and looking at the city policies.
Yeah, so that information that'll give us a little bit more detail so that we'll know what the impact of sort of some of the different heights that are in the alternatives mean.
Mm-hmm. And then I think there's another question too about skyscrapers and why not addressing skyscrapers. So I think there's just a range of questions around too much, too little.
Yeah, right now, the only place where we really see high-rise development happening is in two places, in downtown and in the University District. So I think there's a lot of places in the city that might be more appropriate for high-rise development before this particular area, but maybe in the future sometime high-rises, you know, might become more appropriate in this area, but I don't think we're not proposing to study that alternative. And I don't think that it's very expensive type of construction, and generally the rents in this area probably wouldn't support that. So even if we zoned it for high rise, I'm not sure the development community would build any.
Lisa, you'd asked just briefly about the aesthetics analysis,
Mhm.
and I would actually turn the question back to the audience and ask, what is important to you about your building height questions? What is it that you care about for our analysis of building height? So if it's shadows, or if it's views, or if it's what it feels like walking along the sidewalk, or if it's residential access to open space, or whatever it is, let us know what you're most interested in when you're asking questions about height.
Thanks, Rachel. There are some questions also about accounting for necessary features when there is growth. So parking, such as underbuilding, or making sure that there is open space and that there's a tension between the density and the open space. So I think different questions, but getting at the same thing about development style.
Yeah, and Rachel, I don't know, do you want to take a shot at that question and how that might factor into your analysis?
Could you state the question again?
Well, one question is about making sure there's adequate parking under building, that with growth comes parking. And then another question was the tension between density and development and open space. So two different aspects of how development plays out to ensure there's amenities and support.
Yeah, for the parking related question, it tends to come down a lot to feasibility of parking and how costly it is to build those parking spaces. And then also the building types. So the podium type can accommodate the concrete structured parking underneath and the wood frame above. But smaller building types, you might not tuck as much parking underneath. So the parking can be more hidden in the larger building types sometimes. And And then also the closer you have your buildings to transit and other amenities, then the less reliant they are on those building spaces. So developers tend to build just what's needed for their residents. And then related to density and development types, it's actually really similar to that last thought. Again, the more amenities you have right by you, the more people can live, or the more dense places you have close to amenities, the more people can live within walking distance of those places. Is that what the question was asking about?
I thought they were asking more about what would be studied. Like, would you study the impacts on parking as part of the EIS?
That would be more of a transportation question.
Or would you study the need for open space and as part of the EIS? And
Lisa, I'll let you take the open space one.
There will be an evaluation of parks and recreation and the demand for it as the area grows. So from a broader perspective, I think some of the comments were noting the trade-off between increasing density and how that relates to open space. So I think it's both, Patrice, it's both a design, probably a design or density question, and also yes, we will be addressing the demand for service. And I think as the city is developing the alternatives, you'll be looking at your policies, because it's part of the One Seattle plan, looking at policies and support for housing and amenities.
yeah, and I will say, just on the topic of open spaces, hasn't come up as a question yet, I don't think, but I know over the past 3 years, there's been a lot of people have been interested in perhaps, making some changes to the open space in the area and considering developing maybe some portion of that for housing. And that is not going to be, I can tell you that is not going to be studied as part of the alternatives, because that is really a big citywide issue that isn't really being considered right now, is the reuse of parkland for other uses like housing. So that's not an alternative that we're looking at, proposing to study.
Thanks, Patrice.
So Patrice, next question would be, is there a way to include low-income housing near stations instead of extremely expensive market value townhomes as in Shoreline? So just how does the EIS compare? How does low-income housing factor into the EIS analysis?
Yeah, it will, as we said, there will be some consideration of displacement in both the citywide analysis as well as the analysis for this area. And so affordable housing is obviously a mitigation measure. But I would say probably most of the policies and the strategies would be perhaps not specific for this area, but might be more broadly for areas near high capacity transit or certain areas that are at a high risk of displacement. So I would say the directions are probably going to be more citywide directions than very specific for this area.
I will add, though, that one of the core parts of the EIS will be to try and estimate the number of new market rate housing units at different levels of affordability, and also the number of income restricted affordable units as well. So we are planning to try and quantify that. And part of the comp plan exercise will be thinking through not just where we want the growth, but how we will seek to figure out ways to get affordable housing in there, either through extension of things like mandatory housing affordability requirements, or through other approaches in neighborhood residential areas.
Thank you, Brandon. And I think maybe connected to this question, can additionally is talking about maybe retail or commercial uses, convenience stores, and how they are also being considered within the 130th and 145th stations.
Yeah, so ultimately, as we work through this process and get more specific, we would have zoning that would encourage, and again, what we've heard from the community conversations that we've had so far is that people really want that walkable, pedestrian-oriented retail, especially in the areas closest to the station. So when we get down the road to sort of identifying specific zoning categories, I think you'll see some neighborhood commercial, which is the category that gives us those mixed use building types where you have street level retail with apartments above. So yeah, so that is something that we will be kind of identifying more specifically where those mixed use areas should be, and having specific zoning categories that give us that kind of development.
Thank you. Next question, and it's back to kind of related to SDOT. Is there any effort to coordinate with SDOT work around the stations and the station in Aurora, basically? Is there any connection between what the work that's being done on Aurora and the work that's being done in the 130th station?
Yeah, we have coordinated with SDOT, and those of you who have been at our meetings in the past, it was joint meetings. So there were meetings with staff from the Office of Planning and Community Development talking about land use, and having the SDOT staff, the Department of Transportation, there in the room with us at the same meetings and seeking input from you at the same time. So we continue to work very closely with SDOT on the citywide plans, as well as we'll be getting comments from them as well about these alternatives. So we're going to continue to work closely with SDOT. We know it's really important for this area.
Next question is, and maybe Rachel or Brennan, you can touch on this. It's just a clarification on how can you describe how different alternative 2 and alternative 5 would be specifically for this case?
Yeah, or I can just say briefly that the heights would be taller in alternative 5, and there would be more flexibility for different types of housing in those neighborhood residential areas. So in those areas outside of the nodes, whether it's a small node or an urban village, there would be more change there.
I think, Patrice, another related question to one we had earlier on planning on 145th and Shoreline. On the Seattle side, is there something more specific being considered for 145th Street?
I would have to refer you to our website, where we have links to the many projects that are addressing the 145th corridor, both east and west of I-5. So many transportation things happening in that corridor that would be a whole nother meeting. But just to acknowledge, the city of Shoreline has projects to do improvements on that corridor. Obviously, Sound Transit is making improvements on that corridor. It's a state highway, so the state is involved. There's a multitude of transportation projects. There's a proposal to build roundabouts on either side of I-5 to help improve the traffic flow, in that station area. So yes, that's something to definitely keep your eye on. And we try, and if you sign up for our newsletter, we try and give folks links to all of those projects. And we're also about to issue the final plan for the the document, we issued a draft plan that again included a lot of these recommendations, and we've added a whole section to that plan with links for all of the other projects that are going on. And again, many of them are transportation projects in this area, but there's also, King County is doing some, studies about their main sewer line. And so, yeah, so there's just a lot of stuff happening there. So we hope that that extra section of our plan will help to keep people involved. If you sign up for a newsletter, we try and point folks to community engagement opportunities associated with those projects.
Thank you. I think there was another comment about connectivity to the stationary. So I imagine in those same kinds of documents you're referencing,
Yeah.
Connectivity to the stationary across Aurora would be addressed there. At the top of the meeting, we did put the link to the project website in the chat, and we'll do it again before we go. One question that's about getting around, but from a different angle, is topography. Topography around 130th and 145th, and how that relates to those with different abilities to move around, and how the city would be considering different densities of development as it thinks about topography and mobility.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the access to the station. So locations that are more accessible to the station are certainly ones that we would like to have more density on. I can't say that we have any rules per se about the topography, but there are some what we call environmentally critical areas. So these are places that have very steep slopes, and impacts to those, to that particular kind of environmentally critical area will be evaluated as part of the EIS. So we'll have a little bit more information about how many acres of very steep slopes are different alternatives might impact.
Switching back to affordable housing, which is a really important topic. There were some comments about how much of the new multifamily housing in Shoreline is not necessarily affordable, and maybe expensive, and other comments about density not necessarily meaning affordability. Don't know if you or Brennan want to comment on the range of housing that the city's trying to address.
Yeah, I'll defer to my colleague Brennan, because he's had his sleeves rolled up on these housing programs for very deeply. He's way in there.
Yeah, I guess mostly I'll say thank you for the comment. I don't have there's not one answer, but certainly we know that one of the basic drivers of housing cost is the lack of supply and underproduction that's been happening, and thus the kind of competition for housing. So we know that increasing supply both in Seattle and across the region is extremely important in terms of addressing the affordability issue, which is, again, really a regional one. We've seen prices rising across the entire region. We also know that increasing the diversity of housing can help, because often people can find different opportunities that work for them. Also, larger family units, but also smaller ones, work for different people. And then we have also a lot of tools to try and get at income restricted housing as well. Obviously, the city funds a lot of that, but we also have requirements in all the places that we've rezoned in the past. Are required to contribute to affordable housing through mandatory housing affordability requirements. Either they have to set aside a portion of units on site, or they have to pay into a fund, and then the city is able to use those funds to directly create housing. So I think that for us, that the solution is a lot of different things at once, increasing the supply of housing, the diversity of housing, also creating income restricted affordable housing as well. So I think it's those things together that we're trying to achieve.
So next on the questions is actually more of a comment, but then it connects to maybe another question. So there just seems to be support for the 15-minute neighborhood concepts, or especially around the station area. And then the question that maybe connects to this is, where would potential nodes be in the 145th and 130th areas? Do you have a general sense of where they would be or potentially be at?
Yeah, well, what we've heard through the work that we've done with the community so far is certainly the area right adjacent to the 130th station seems to be on the top of everyone's list. Also, the area on 145th near 15th, because that's a place where we see a lot of one-story retail with lots of parking. So when planners see a place like that, they see redevelopment opportunity. But we'd love to hear from you. Like, where do you think the node should be in that neighborhood? Maybe there's a very small little commercial area on the west side of I-5. Should that be a node? Or so that would be really great feedback for you to give us as we try and get more specific about these concepts.
Thank you. And this relates to a previous question about along 145th and the widening of sidewalks. I don't know if you have anything else to add in terms of also any plans around planting trees along the sidewalk or adding a protected bike lane along 145th and just making it more accessible for people with disabilities, but also just in general, making it more comfortable.
And again, I think if you go to our website and we have a link to the multimodal mobility study. And I think that's the best place where you can get a sense of what the Department of Transportation, which are the projects that they're thinking of taking to the next steps, which are the projects that maybe you'll see in the next transportation levy. So I think that would be, a good for people who are very interested in where those improvements might happen. That's the best place to refer to.
And I think the next question relates to the presentation. Can the EIS combine? So I think what the question is asking is, can there be combined alternatives as kind of the final choice as we go forward as the EIS? Can like an alternative 1 and alternative 2 and alternative 3, or can we get features from different processes?
I think ultimately we study these alternatives, and again, we pick them so that they're distinct. But what we learn may lead us to want to combine features of each of those alternatives in our what eventually we'll call the preferred alternative. So it doesn't mean just because we have these 3 alternatives, it doesn't mean we have to pick one of them as studied in the EIS, but it's like within the range of what's been studied. So, but certainly if you think that there is an alternative, that middle alternative, there is a different middle alternative, or again, some people seem to be very interested in studying something even, more dense than what we've described. That's, that would be feedback. That would be great feedback to give us during this scoping time.
Back to the call that you and Rachel made for folks to indicate what their concern is on height. We did hear back from some folks about being concerned about building heights because it could block the sun for neighboring houses, and a concern for changes to trees and green space as the area grows. So that is something, as Rachel and I discussed, that the EIS would address is changes to views, shade shadow, and we will be addressing changes in overall demand for parks. Other folks similarly indicating concern about shade shadows with tall buildings, canopy, and wildlife, while still wanting to have some amenities and gathering places and destinations. So a balance in how the area grows and the amenities provided without losing what makes the area walkable. Just wanted to report back on that because the folks leaned in on the responses to that. Other questions that kind of get at design, but also affordable housing and city intent would be, has the city considered or will there be a consideration of using cross-laminated mass timber to build in a more sustainable way and to create open space?
I can take that. I mean, so the city doesn't require specific types of construction except for, in cases, like basic structural issues, like if you're above a certain height, you have to use steel and concrete or cross-laminated timber. But certainly that is a possibility, that something that people could use. And especially when you get in heights around, 95 feet, that is kind of a preferred technique for buildings of those types. So, while we don't have a program to incentivize that as opposed to different types, we have done a lot actually to allow it and made changes to the code to allow it. And, with higher heights, you might actually see people tend to use that because that's where it seems to be more viable.
Thank you. I'm just scanning some similar issues.
Lisa, there is a question about, and I don't know if this was touched on already, about would design guidelines apply to the station area? And if none apply, could the community start a process to create local design guidelines?
It's not something that is specifically studied as part of the EIS, but the design review program is undergoing a review, so there may be changes coming to that program as it is. But there would certainly, right now, if it works the way it does now, the types of projects that go through design review, even if there weren't specific design guidelines for this station area, they would be reviewed with citywide design guidelines.
Okay, thank you. And next question. What steps will be taken to curb street parking in neighborhoods adjacent to the station? Or will there be steps taken to curb street parking in neighborhoods adjacent to the station? And this may be a question that relates to the link that you've already, or to the SDOT programming that you've already done, but maybe you have some other feedback.
Yeah, and actually that's something that's also highlighted in our draft plan. We have a little call out that talks about the residential parking permit. And so that is a process that the Department of Transportation will undertake. About, my understanding is it starts about 18 months before the station opens. And they do a survey of all of the on-street parking, and it's very likely that there will be restricted parking, because we don't want commuters using up all the street parking.
There's a couple other questions on parking about whether, I think this was the detail that goes beyond the level of detail for the EIS, but will there be exemptions from providing parking garages? And then also, if there isn't sufficient parking on site, then people are circulating and looking for parking.
So there will not be any park and ride at the 130th light rail station. There is a parking garage at the Shoreline South station. So I think that was like, yeah, so just to clarify that, that's always been part of the plan from the beginning, is not to have any park and ride at the 130th station.
And I think, Patrice, the concern is broader than that. I think it's in denser areas, as there's more density provided, will there be sufficient parking so people aren't looking for street parking?
Yeah, I mean, the existing policy that the city has now, there's something called the frequent transit service area. And this area would be part of that, the area within a half mile of the light rail station, as well as areas within a quarter mile of any frequent bus service that feeds those areas, and the parcels that are within that frequent transit service area do not have parking minimums. So that's already an existing policy, and that policy would apply to this area as the transit. And it applies to this area already where there's frequent transit, and that would grow bigger once the light rail service is in place.
There's a few questions on different environmental impacts. One is about whether the EIS will study greenhouse gas emissions, also water drainage, basically. On the greenhouse gas, it's about, will there be differentiation among the alternatives? And is affordability concerns push growth outward from Seattle? Will that also be accounted for? How does the growth in Seattle relate to greenhouse gas in the region, I think? Whereas the water issues, water runoff is more local to the study area.
Do you want me to do the greenhouse gas one, Patrice, or?
Sure.
So yeah, the EIS will look at greenhouse gas emissions from a variety of sources. We will have a transportation model that will look at, based on land use changes, how will that likely affect trip patterns, both in terms of the where people are going, the length they're driving, the mode they're using, and then we will translate that into greenhouse gas emissions from transit using kind of established modeling tools. We'll also do the same thing for land use patterns, looking at for building impacts. And so we'll look at land use patterns and use existing models to translate that into building energy use, as well as energy use from solid waste and utilities. So that will get at very specific greenhouse gas emissions. SEPA, unfortunately, is it really directs cities to look at the impacts within the study area, so which is the city itself in this case. And so we are not going to be looking at the kind of the regional impacts as part of the EIS. However, there is a hope that we might do that kind of separately so people just understand that. And in terms of the water and drainage, that, yes, that's an explicit part of the EIS, also is to look at potential impacts to the utility system, as well as the natural environment, from runoff and other things, and as well as development impacts.
Okay, so next question, how do we maximize the amount of affordable housing in the new urban village, is the question.
Yeah, so I think this is really about the implementation of ultimately whatever comprehensive plan. Will there be new tools for affordable housing that could apply to the 130th and 145th station area? So we certainly have a set number of tools now. So I don't know if the comprehensive plan will lead us to have some new tools, but that's certainly possible. Brennan, I don't know if you wanted to, if you have anything to add in terms of what might be in store.
Yeah, there is obviously the assumption that any large buildings would be required to contribute to affordable housing through mandatory housing affordability requirements. And we have a policy that, the bigger the rezones, the higher the mandatory housing affordability requirements. And so in that sense, the more development that is allowed and the more that occurs, the more money that will come in, the more contribution either through performance on site or through payment. So I think that's one way. And then, obviously the second major aspect is how the city chooses to spend our dollars. And so, obviously, again, if there's more zoning capacity for apartments, that creates more sites that the city can use to develop affordable housing projects as well.
Yeah, I'll also mention that the 145th BRT project is requiring Sound Transit to acquire some of those commercial properties along the corridor. And their policy is to make those properties, if they're surplus after construction, either free or for reduced rates for the development of affordable housing. So I think there's a good opportunity that we may see some affordable housing development in that location.
Thank you. I'm gonna just read off some things that are comments just to kind of get them said out loud and circulated and respected, and then I'll get to the next question. One is just somebody in support of, or the city should consider and is of support of maybe some more high rises throughout the city. And so just something for the city to consider as they go future into the study. Another is concern or struggle around getting across I-5 on a bike and within the study area. And whether the EIS should analyze bike connectivity to the stations and how different alternatives would approve that. And I think that maybe connects to, again, the SDOT kind of multimodal study previously stated. And then I'll get to the question, which is just a clarification question. Is middle housing included in alternative 5?
Yeah, so in terms of the bike access, that is one of the 18 priority projects, is some rechannelization across the bridge at 130th to improve bike access to that station. At the Shoreline South Station, there's going to be a new pedestrian and bicycle bridge. So so definitely check that out when that gets constructed.
And Patrice, before you go on to the housing question that Marcus raised, I think a related question was about city standards about keeping delivery trucks out of the bike lanes. It's from the same commenter.
Yeah, I know that curb space is a very valuable resource and is one of the issues that the Department of Transportation is going to be exploring through the citywide Seattle transportation plan. So again, there may be some new policies coming out of that work that would apply to the station area.
Thank you. And back to Marcus, I think you teed up some other affordable housing question.
Yeah, I think the question was really about whether missing middle housing or kind of duplexes, triplexes, those the plexus sorts will be included in alternative 5, or is that to be understood as included in alternative 5?
Yeah.
That's for the citywide, and I guess that then connects to our alternative 3 here for the 130th and 145th station.
Yes. Yeah, so that's what that light blue area means, more housing types.
I think continuing on with housing, has there been a study analyzing the cost of new units? The ones near Roosevelt Station are far from affordable. We touched on that a little bit with Shoreline being the example.
Yeah, the city has done a lot of work on looking at the housing market. We, at least last year, report market rate housing supply and needs analysis, which has a lot of data on the cost of housing. Yeah, so I think that probably is the best source that has a lot of information about that subject.
Yeah, and I would just mention that Bellwether has a very large project at the Roosevelt Station. So so I think the affordable housing developers are interested, if they have the opportunity to secure development sites near light rail stations. So
there's some comments that are more specific about being concerned about being displaced in the neighborhood by 145th and the new station, a neighborhood that supports a wide variety of folks living there now. And also comments that some forms of housing, including missing middle, may be difficult for some folks, like those who are senior citizens or disabled, to be able to use those units.
Yeah, I think providing accessible units is, maybe not a topic as much of the EIS, but is an important part of the comp plan update. We do have requirements that in all new apartment buildings have to have set aside a certain number of units that are accessible. Obviously, it's more difficult for in areas that are zoned for detached homes or duplex triplexes, townhouses, because they tend to be multi-story, both existing buildings and new ones. But so I think there's obviously some opportunities for getting more kind of small apartments in some of those missing middle zones. And then obviously the larger apartment buildings are required to have accessible units as part of them.
Thank you. There's a broader question about the difference between affordable housing and low-income housing.
So we as the city don't tend to use the term affordable housing because obviously it's a little bit more vague. We tend to use income restricted housing as a term, and that is housing that is it has restrictions on it that those units have to be set aside for people that make a certain amount of money and are affordable to those people. Obviously, those projects require subsidy, and so they're really only projects that the city has some role in funding. And then, obviously market rate housing can vary substantially. Some of the smaller units can be affordable to people making as little as 50% of the area median income. But then you also can have very expensive units, and it varies largely by size. And so, with market, it can varies over time, and you can find that some of those market rates can be affordable, but again, the market sets the rates. And so as the prices across the city have gone up, so have prices in existing buildings and new buildings as well. So we don't tend to use the word affordable for market rate, because while at some points it may be without a restriction, you can't guarantee that it will stay in place.
Thank you. I think we have still a wide range of questions that vary from still various transportation improvements. And so I think, Patrice, the answer is likely similar to referring to the document, but there were some comments about putting in a two-way left turn lane on the bridge over the freeway at 130th, and a concern about excessive speeding on Roosevelt. And then another concern about, or a statement about the left turn, that some of the improvements could help at the freeway entrance, would help traffic at the freeway entrance. So I don't know if it sounds like, we did put the link in the chat, but if there's any other comments in terms of the freeway and improvements in and near the freeway to help.
Yeah, there's been extensive traffic studies as part of the design of the 130th station, and also the bus service that will be serving that station. And so you will see a lot of changes at that intersection.
Okay. And I think as well, the concerns about being walkable near the station, there was a concern that no new sidewalks were being proposed, but it sounds like there's multimodal improvements being planned around the station. Is that correct?
Yeah, obviously there's the public improvements that are part of the station, but then also I know those of you in the area have noticed that Fifth Avenue has been closed for a long time because that's being used as a construction staging area, and that road will be restored, and there will be some improvements on Fifth Avenue, a bike lane and some sidewalks across from the station. So there will be some of those improvements as part of the immediate station area. Like the area that's like, directly adjacent to the light rail station.
Sure.
In the broader area, again, that's something that will evolve over time.
So next question starts out with a kind of a comment or just some feedback for the process of creating a node around the old 7-Eleven on Roosevelt by First Avenue. And that this commenter kind of asks as a question, or would love to see a cafe and restaurant, and just how does cafe and small businesses kind of relate into this process and analysis?
I think, it doesn't, the EIS doesn't really consider the size of the businesses. But I think as we get into more detailed zoning, there can be some development controls that are added to a particular zone in a particular place to try and encourage certain building features. So that's something that can be considered a little bit further down the road.
Okay, the next question, commenter, North Precinct already can't support the needs of the area. Will that be part of the evaluation as well? Is the question.
So police service is one of the services that's evaluated in the EIS. It's probably more applicable to the citywide EIS because obviously the precinct has a very large service area. So yes, that is part of the EIS process.
Marcus, do you want to talk about the building heights and some of the other related elements there?
Yeah. So it's just kind of the commenter is wanting the process or the analysis to take into consideration building heights and how they interact with natural areas and creeks and trees, and just a general concern about potentially this neighborhood losing its natural areas for development around the light rail station or because of the sub area station. So
yeah, so I think that, as I said before, it's we talked about that there is going to be some analysis of tree canopy. There will also be analysis of environmentally critical areas, which includes those steep slopes, the areas adjacent to the creek. The Thornton Creek runs right through this area. Impacts on parks. So that is all part of the EIS process.
Thank you.
And then if there is an impact, how the city might mitigate it. And the other thing I'll just point out is that the EIS is going to have a lot of information about what policies, what regulations the city has in place to mitigate impacts that, that again, you might not be aware of. So that will be information that will be available as well.
Thanks, Patrice. The last couple of questions are both related to affordable housing. One has to do with whether the city has looked at the ARCH model, which is a regional coalition for housing model that's on the east side, King County, to promote affordable rentals and affordable home ownership. Another is just a concern about whether any of the housing that's being built these days is affordable, and if it's market rate, will it become unaffordable? So a concern that there'll be cut funding. So one is about maybe like a policy or mitigation measure about how to provide affordable housing in a coordinated way. And another one is a concern about, is there going to be enough resources?
Yeah, I mean, I just is Brennan still on? So
No.
I would just refer back to some of the comments that were offered earlier from Brennan Staley. There is a citywide process. We have existing programs. There's been a very detailed housing needs assessment in the citywide comprehensive plan. There is going to be more specific information about not just the total amount of housing that we need, but how much housing we need at different income brackets. So the EIS process doesn't really propose what those solutions are, but that is definitely something that's part of the conversation of this citywide comprehensive plan update. So I really encourage anyone who is concerned about affordable housing and wants to continue to contribute and be engaged with the conversation around affordable housing to get involved with that process. I mean, we have a whole, what we call a housing element in the citywide comprehensive plan that provides some broad direction for where those new approaches might be. You know, what are the approaches that the city isn't using now that we might consider in the future? So the EIS isn't going to give you that information, but the comprehensive plan policies hopefully will.
Thank you. There's a comment in support about tracking impacts to minority-owned businesses in the study area, and I know the city is considering reviewing displacement of concerns about businesses and housing in your plan update process. Yeah, I'm not aware of us tracking, the racial makeup of businesses in the area, but that's something I guess we would have to consider. I don't think we have that information readily available right now. Sure. Generally, displacement is being addressed in the city policy review. I think we can put in the chat, there are, maybe Rachel, you can find the link to the One Seattle. There are some metrics being considered through the EIS and and outside of the EIS that have to do with some equity and climate metrics that we could refer to and think about what's the best way to address that. So I think Rachel just put that or is putting that in the chat right now. And then we have one final question that is relatively complex, but I think there's a concern that I think this goes back to an earlier discussion about the vision statement of the plan and things not necessarily being in place yet, that it's forward looking, and a concern that how will it happen? Is it a pipe dream? And, you know, would the city have to move to actually acquiring property to make that vision happen? How, you know, how that comes about when the city's creating a vision, how does that come about?
And yeah, so I want to be very clear about this because there was a lot of misinformation about this when Shoreline was doing their rezoning. The city does not use its power of eminent domain, does not condemn property, that is not what this planning process is about. The state of Washington does not allow us to use the power of eminent domain for economic, quote unquote, economic development. So that is not how change happens. Change happens when we can change the rules for what an individual landowner can do on their property, but we do not develop the property. We do not acquire property for redevelopment. That is all done by the private or the nonprofit sector. So yeah, so just want to like make sure, be very clear about that, because that's something that people are justifiably afraid of. And so rezoning does not mean that we're going to condemn your property. It just means we change the rules of what you, a property owner, can do with their property.
Thank you, Patrice. So I believe we've made it through our Q&A. I want to mention that Rachel did put a link to the draft metrics, which are under review in the scoping process for climate and equity indicators, some of which will be addressed in the EIS and some of which will be addressed through the planning process. And then Marcus has put a couple of other links to the One Seattle Plan website regarding equity, some of the fact sheets the city has provided on equity and on climate change. So just wanted to point that out since that related to one of the last questions. So Patrice, do you want to have any final words?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone and particularly those who hung in there waiting to have their questions answered. I really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing your comments about these alternatives and then moving on to the next stage and continuing this conversation over the next 2 years. I did also want to just note that we did extend the comment period. So, so you still have plenty of time to think about it and talk to your neighbors and send us your comments.
And Patrice, I believe that's August 22nd.
Yes.
Is the new date. And Ben has shown on the slide there your contact information.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Still some time to enjoy the sunset.
Just saying some final words of thanks, just typing in that final chat. So we'll end the session. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.